Yes, so I thought it would be important to talk about something that helped Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors, colonize, take over lands, was their war dogs. They actually played a big role. One war dog will kill many men, along with being able to track people, protect, alert. These dogs are really trained to kill, as it says here, trained to kill dogs of the Spanish conquistadors. One of the type of dogs they brought was the Alant or Alano dog, a type of mastiff, as you guys can see here, the Alano dog or the Alano Espanol. Some people call it the Spanish bulldog, as you guys can see. A dog that hunts, a very protective dog, a lot of strength, very smart. These are the type of dogs they were bringing over here to kill Indians. Many types of mastiff breeds they brought along, such as these types right here as well. But the Alano was one of the main types. As you guys can see, very intimidating dog.
All right, so we're in the book now called The Conquest of the New World or American Holocaust by David E. Stannard. Wherever the marauding, diseased, and heavily armed Spanish forces went out on patrol, accompanied by ferocious armored dogs that had been trained to kill and disembowel, they preyed on the local communities, already plagued and feebled, forcing them to supply food and women and slaves, all right, slaves, and whatever else the soldiers might desire. All right, so before we continue, just wanted to show one example of these war dogs or dogs that these conquistadors, the Spanish, Portuguese conquistadors had with them when they came to the Americas. All right, so we got this Alano Espanol or the Spanish Alano. It says here the breed is best known for its former use during Spanish bullfights. They used to put them against bulls. That's how strong these dogs are. All right. And down here where the history part of this dog is, we get what I'm talking about. It says here, dogs of this type traveled with the Spanish explorers and were used as war dogs, as were their role in Eurasia before migration, in the subjugation of Indian Native American peoples, as well as in the capturing of slaves. They were talking about you. They used to send these crazy ancestors of the, believe it or not, the American people. These were very vicious, trained dogs, all right? And they sent them out to elderly men, women, and children. They didn't care.
All right, so let's get into this book. It's called Dogs of the Conquest by John Grier Varner and Jeanette Johnson Varner. It says here in chapter 1, the Caribbean Islands. All right, so in chapter 1, it starts talking about the second voyage of Columbus. It says here, in consequence, he made certain that when Columbus' splendid fleet sailed in September 1493, it was adequately equipped with men, arms, and a pack of 20 purebred mastiffs and greyhounds. These dogs and the others that followed were to lay a bloody trail across the islands and mainland of the new-found world. On his return to Hispaniola, Columbus discovered that the licentious behavior of the men he had left there had provoked an unexpected hostility among the natives, and both he and his soldiers now realized that the 20 dogs that Archdeacon Fonseca had provided would serve a far more valuable purpose than that of tasting suspect food. The first incident recorded in which a dog served a military purpose in the Indies occurred on the island of Jamaica. When Columbus approached the shore of that island on May 5, 1494, at a site that he later was to name Puerto Bueno, he observed that the Indians were painted black or various colors and appeared to be hostile. Since the fleet needed wood and water, and because the admiral had concluded that the time had come to make a display of Castilian arms, 3 of the ships drew near to the shore and the soldiers fired their crossbows. They then disembarked, slashed many Indians with swords, and continued to fire. The Indians fled in surprised terror, pursued by a great dog that bit them and did them much harm. For one dog against the Indians was worth 10 men. Columbus then went ashore and took possession of the island in the name of the Spanish sovereigns. This attack represents the first occasion on which dogs were used against the natives of the New World and predates their formal use in pitched battle on the Vega Real. Before I continue, I just wanted to show you this image I got the dog biting this person's head right here. First says here the first dogging of Indians on the island of Jamaica, May 5th, 1494, would have been similar to the one pictured here, though this one probably took place in Puerto Rico from Antonio de Herrera y Tordesillas. Okay. Continuing says here, and Alonso de Ojeda, whom Columbus had sent to establish a series of forts on the Vega Real of Hispaniola, had provoked and was continuing to provoke the Indians along the route of his expedition by many instances of rape and enslavement. Okay, enslavement. Who are they enslaving? Who are the Spanish enslaving? Indians, not Africans. Fearful for his whole enterprise, Columbus decided to lead an expedition into the interior himself. As he proceeded, he sought to obtain information by peaceful methods, but when these efforts failed, he unleashed his dogs and subjected the natives to a cruel pursuit. In the ensuing flights, many Indians were slain or captured for the slave marts of Seville. They were what? They were sent to Seville, to Europe, to the slave markets in Seville, Spain. Remember that, because I got a video coming out about this. Who was really in Seville? So when they're saying they're bringing so-called Negroes from Seville into America, who was really in Seville getting enslaved and brought to other parts of the world. Remember that. So these Indians are being captured, right? Not Africans, are being sent to Europe, Seville. Among those taken were the cacique Guatiwana or Watiwana and two of his vassals. Although scheduled to be hanged the following morning, they managed during the night to gnaw through their thongs and escape, and Guatiwana, bent on the destruction of all Spaniards at Isabella, organized a menacing force. The Indians hoped to deter the invaders by planting no more maize, but thus left themselves with nothing to eat except yuca, and the Spaniards, too, were soon starving. In the ensuing period of great hunger, the Christians ate all the animals they could catch, using their dogs for the hunt. Then, after eating all the native dogs available, they were eating all the shallots and all these dogs that were native, the Spaniards. They ungratefully rewarded their own dogs by eating them as well. This is what the Spaniards were doing, guys. This was a use for which the European dog was never intended, but to which it repeatedly was put. Continuing says here, in 1495, on March 27, Columbus, his forces met those of the cacique Guatiguana, remember after he escaped, on the Vega Real, the struggle that ensued being designated by chroniclers as the first pitched battle between Europeans and Indians. Columbus placed his horses and dogs at the disposal of the jaunty little Alonso de Ojeda, who had learned the art of warfare in the struggle with the Moors of Granada. Ojeda was unusually adept in handling both horses and dogs. When the Battle of the Vega Real was raging, he released the 20 mastiffs with a loud "Tómalos," take them, sick them, at which the infuriated hounds hurled themselves at the Indians' naked bodies, grabbed them by their bellies and throats, threw them to the ground, disemboweled them, and ripped them to pieces. Bartolomé de las Casas reported with passionate censure that in 1 hour each dog ripped to bits 100 Indians, and that the animals found the skin of these wretches far easier to tear than boar or deer hide. The struggle was brought to a desolate end with the aid of 20 Spanish dogs. The comment of Las Casas suggests that these animals originally had been trained for hunting, but on the plains of the New World, they began, as Fonseca had surely anticipated, to favor human flesh. And at the Battle of the Vega Real, Columbus, the explorer and mariner and slaver, apparently experienced that peculiar and tenacious thrill of the landsman for the hunt. He was impressed by the havoc his hounds had wrought under the efficient guidance of Ojeda, and as the cacique Guatiguana and his surviving Indians fled in terror toward the wilderness, the admiral realized the potential use of his dogs. And here we got a little drawing, right, of the Spaniards attacking the Indians with their dogs. Continue a little ahead, it says, in a cedula dated April 9, 1495, the king and queen directed Archdeacon Fonseca to send 4 more caravels with supplies to Hispaniola, and among the livestock specified are both Alanos, all right, the Alano bulldogs, and the Mastines, to guard commodities and offer protection to the Spaniards. To retrieve fugitives, especially those in mountain fastnesses, dogs were found to be of great advantage. They could track down natives, distinguishing their trails from those of Christians, and could uncover their hiding places and ambushes. Furthermore, these dogs could, in the end, slaughter their prey. Las Casas wrote that when the Indians saw themselves being destroyed by such inhuman means, trampled by horses, lanced, slashed by swords, burned alive, and devoured by dogs, they simply agreed to submit to any fate so long as they could avoid eradication. All right, we're going to go ahead and read this article. It's from the Colonial Latin American Review, Volume 31, Number 3. The article is called From Hunters to Hell Hounds, the Dogs of Columbus, and Transformations of the Human-Canine Relationship in the Early Spanish Caribbean by John J. Ensminger. Christopher Columbus first used dogs for military purposes in the New World during his second voyage, a war technology that continued to be employed by the conquistadors for more than a century. After the Battle of Vega, Real, the military functions of dogs began to dominate Spanish thinking, with some dogs becoming superstars, their fame spreading among both Spanish and indigenous people and into history. As the conquest advanced, their aggression was institutionalized as instruments of punishment and execution by Cortés, the Pizarros, de Soto, Coronado, and others. Becerrillo sired Leonçico, and bloodlines of the best fighters and most aggressive executioners became valuable. Yet as indigenous populations became familiar with the Spanish dogs, they became effective in countering their military value, and they were increasingly reserved for punishments. The New World was a laboratory for the use of canine aggression in enforcing social order. I'm going to read from this book now. It's called A Dog's History of America, How Our Best Friend Explored, Conquered, and Settled a Continent. We're going to belly flop to chapter 2. It says here, Deadly Encounters, Dogs of Mayhem and Slaughter, Take the New World for Spain. Spain at the time was fixated on the concept of blood purity, limpieza de sangre, which its soldiers and priests applied to humans as well as animals. In the decades just before Columbus' first voyage, inquisitors sought to root out the impure of spirit and blood, investigating and condemning Jews, Sephardic Jews and Moors, remember the Inquisition, who had converted to Catholicism to escape expropriation, expulsion, or death. Having cast them out, the inquisitors then turned on those who remained true to the faith of their fathers and mothers. The same concept was applied to breeding livestock, horses, and dogs. Lebrel, a fast-chased dog, sometimes associated with a greyhound, a mastin or mastiff, sabueso, a bloodhound, and alano, the alanos or wolfhounds, a rough combination of the two types, with different monasteries or nobles maintaining their own lines. So these are some of the main breeds they brought along. These divisions were based on size, coat coloration, and use by tradition. Light-colored mastiffs were used to guard flocks in the belief that they would not scare the sheep, and dark-colored ones to guard homes and to fight because they terrorized people. They were not breeds as they are known today, divided by registries and close adherence to standards. Eventually, all these dogs, as well as spaniels and settlers, made it to America, along with the concept of blood purity, but the most significant were the Lebrel, the Mastin, Alano, and Sabueso, and crosses involving them that ultimately became known as the Cuban Bloodhound, a fearsome long-legged dog with size, endurance, strength, and a mastiff's crushing jaws, used to track down and kill slaves. The forebears of these dogs and their handlers had learned the art of la monteria infernal, the infernal chase, in the Canary Islands in 1480, when they literally ran to ground, maimed, killed, and devoured the natives. But the fell beasts were even better known for feasting on children abandoned at the doors of churches and mosques by their desperate parents during Ferdinand and Isabella's successful campaign to seize Granada from the Moors. That victory came just months before Columbus' first voyage. A few of these dogs, or their offspring, were doubtless on his second trip. It says here in Hispaniola, the Spaniards who arrived on Columbus' second voyage ate virtually all the native dogs. Within a few years, and subsequent waves of Spaniards continued to practice wherever they went. Markets in Central America became stocked with hundreds of dogs, large and small, sold and butchered for immediate consumption, along with and often preferred to turkeys, pigs, and other livestock. Some markets also sold butchered Indians as dog food. In fact, there is a stronger case to be made for the Spaniards eating the native dogs into extinction than for the Paleo Indians hunting large mammals into oblivion at the end of the Pleistocene, all right? So when they say native dogs, are they talking about the Xolots quintile, the Xolo dog? When the Spaniards ran out of native dogs and still faced starvation, they ate their own dogs in a peculiar form of cannibalism, since those animals had fed on the flesh of native people and were treated better than most Spanish soldiers, not to mention Indians. After their first victories, Columbus and his subalterns and successors regularly deployed dogs. Dogs were loosed on caciques or children by accident, all right, in parentheses, or in sport, and the deaths that followed inevitably led to greater conflict. The Taínos struggled against their enslavement and the constant demands for more food, more women, more gold. They fled to the mountains and were hunted down with dogs, all right? Maroons going to the mountains? Who's going to the mountains? Once found, they were hanged or slowly roasted to death in the name of our Redeemer and his apostles, all right? In the name of their Redeemer, just like Hatuey, right? In the name of Jesus. And fetuses were ripped from their mothers' wombs. Las Casas said enslaved, lashed, dogged the Taíno were called dogs so frequently that the word became a foul insult. By then, dogs were being specifically bred and trained to hunt down and disembowel Indians, okay? As the conquistadors pursued their quest for gold and other riches. Conditions in the gold mines of Hispaniola were so depraved early in the 16th century that slaves joined with dogs in scavenging bones under their masters' tables. In despair, people committed suicide, often by drinking the toxic juice of manioc. All right, you guys hear what's going on here? A little further ahead in the book, it already explained a little bit of what we have read, throughout Latin America. I continue saying here that dogs went everywhere, sweeping with their masters through Mexico and into what is now the southwestern United States, running amok through the mountains, valleys, and jungles of South America, even into the Amazon, where tribes that may never have known dogs eagerly adopted them as hunters and companions, and probing through Florida and up the Mississippi River as they had on the islands. The conquistadors obliterated cultures, people, and animals. They changed forever the way survivors lived and altered entire ecosystems by introducing horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and dogs. All right, pigs, they brought pigs, and by extracting mineral wealth and timber. Although the role of the war dogs nearly vanished from memory until the Varners resurrected their sordid history in 1983, their legacy was strongly felt well into the 19th century through their notorious descendants, especially Cuban bloodhounds, probably crosses between mastiffs and greyhounds. The bloodhounds first earned their reputation for ferocity for their role in suppressing, in 1 year, Jamaica's long-running Maroon Rebellion of 1655-1739. They were equally renowned as trackers and abusers of runaway slaves, all right? So you see how the same kind of dogs that were doing it to the Indians just kept doing it to the so-called slaves or runaway slaves. Here we got an account of Narvaez, another Spanish here in North America, meeting Usita, a chief who sometimes called Jirigua, a Tampa Bay chief, had directed him to the Appalachia after convincing the fortune hunter that his people had no gold of their own. As thanks, Narvaez reportedly cut off Usita's nose and unloosed his war dogs on the cacique's mother. Do you hear that? A little further ahead, it says the Spaniards had more dogs and continued to lose them on guides and other Indians as they trudged north through the pine flatwoods and swamps of the west side of the Florida peninsula, aiming for Appalachian territory. In most cases, they followed existing well-used Indian trails. It's called Dogs of the Conquest by John Grier Varner and Jeanette Johnson Varner. And continue a little bit ahead in this book, it talks about the part when Columbus actually got replaced. He was put to chains and sent to jail in Spain. If you guys didn't know, that's how Columbus ended up. So it says Francisco de Bobadilla was ordered to Hispaniola to investigate the situation and temporarily replace Columbus in command, landing at Santo Domingo, Bobadilla soon threw Columbus into chains and sent him back to Spain. All right. Now, this same Bobadilla, I'm going to show you how cruel he was. Francisco de Bobadilla eagerly used dogs as instruments of his policy. Yet to be effective, the dogs had to be well fed. To a great extent, the conquerors and settlers permitted their dogs to forage for their own food. In Europe, dogs long had been scavengers. And in the New World, hungry dogs roam in the streets of filthy new settlements, snatching up whatever offal they could find, became a common sight. When hunting, dogs in the Indies, like those in Spain, were permitted to eat that part of the catch that their masters found unpalatable. They roamed the countryside, too, eating what they captured, until they began seriously to deplete the land of its edible stock, both domestic and wild. But the dogs of the conquerors and early settlers were, in the main, war dogs, and as such were trained purposely to relish Indian flesh, to eat the Indians. Thus, in combat, or after a struggle was over, they gorged on the bodies of the victims. Not only was this destruction permitted, it was encouraged, both as an effective maneuver in the cruel process of subjugation and as an economy of war. Also, it was an easy means of providing them food. Sometimes non-combatant Indians, even children, all right, even children were handed over simply as tasty morsels to voracious hounds. They was feeding children to the dogs. The dogs left behind by Columbus had by now greatly increased in number and ferocity, but Bobadilla apparently continued to train dogs to attack like wild beasts, to disembowel and devour. Both he and his successor, Nicolas de Ovando, made cruel and wanton use of dogs. A letter of protest dated June 4, 1516, from 14 Dominican priests of Hispaniola to a royal councillor related, for example, how on one occasion some Christians came across an Indian woman with a nursing child in her arms. Since their dog was hungry, they seized the child and tossed it to the dog. Wow, that's so cruel. Do you guys hear that? These dogs tore it to pieces in the presence of the mother. The priests describe how the Christians used natives as beasts of burden, loading them with heavy packs and forcing them to march 60 or 70 leagues without food. The Christian brought along large mastiffs to discourage escape, so that the dogs might not bruise their feet from too much walking. They were borne in hammocks between the shoulders of Indians. If an Indian fled, a dog would catch him and tear out his entrails before the Christians overtook him. For these and similar reasons, dogs were held in greater esteem and valued more highly than Indians. The natives of Saona long had been friendly with the Christians and had supplied them generously with cassava. In the spring of 1502, a group of Spaniards had landed with a dog and were observing a cacique who, in his efforts to hasten transport of the native bread to the ship, was lashing his vassals furiously with his stick. The sight of such violence so agitated the high-strung mastiff that he struggled frantically to free himself from his chain in order to attack. Amused, the dog's master remarked to a comrade that he imagined it would provide a spectacle worth seeing if he should release the animal's chain. Unaware of the dog's true strength, the comrade turned and jestingly uttered the golden order, "Tómalo," and at once the dog lunged forward with such force that he dragged his master after him for some distance. All right, so they're saying it was an accident, but it sounds like he actually did sick him after him. The hound soon freed himself and sank his fangs into the cacique's abdomen. When the terrified Indian sought to flee, the animal tugged so obstinately that he tore out the man's intestines, killing him. The Spaniards, with little thought of the possible consequences of this incident, boarded their caravel and sailed away. But the natives of the entire region were enraged, and especially embittered was Cotubanama, the cacique of the nearby province of Higüey, whose wrath the Spaniards subsequently were to feel. So the book basically explains how the dogs are being used literally to help them colonize, establish themselves, and they played a major role here in the conquest. Many times the dogs got loose. A couple stories just like the one we heard where they get loose and they attack a cacique and rip his stomach up, and nothing happens, and then the people retaliate, and then they get killed as well for retaliating. Says here, ironically, the dogs that Columbus and his followers had brought to Hispaniola had increased so much an extent that they were destroying game animals and livestock. The Spaniards had given some of these dogs to Indians who, not knowing how to care for them, had turned them loose to run wild as cimarrones. They soon became such a menace that a royal decree was issued to kill them, or if possible to capture and retrain them as hunting dogs. All right, so there were so many of them running loose now, like packs of these wild, crazy dogs. Continuing a little ahead, it talks about Juan Ponce de Leon arriving at Hispaniola, where Diego Columbus was established as Christopher Columbus' son. And Diego Columbus was used to having dogs. He did it for sport. He did dogging a lot. Says when Diego Columbus arrived in Hispaniola in 1509, Juan Ponce de Leon, whom Ovando had authorized to explore the island of Borinquen, Puerto Rico, hastened back to Hispaniola to have this authority confirmed by the new governor. He soon departed for Puerto Rico again, bearing this time the legal title of governor of that island. And his various difficulties with the natives of the region, Juan Ponce undoubtedly used whatever dogs he had available, but chroniclers have limited their reports of dogging on Puerto Rico almost exclusively to accounts of a large greyhound called Becerrillo, a little bull calf. So now we're going to talk about Becerrillo. This dog was actually very famous in history. His reputation for killing Indians and helping the Spanish is well known in their chronicles. Says Becerrillo's origin is uncertain. Had he been one of the first dogs that Christopher Columbus brought to the Indies, he would have been too old to have served in Puerto Rico, with the effectiveness tradition has bestowed upon him. Yet he could not have been a young dog, for he had established an enduring record before 1511 when he appeared on that island, and his equally famous whelp, Leonçico or Leoncillo, Little Lion, right? That's his son, who was also very famous, you guys are going to see, was a full-grown dog with a reputation for vicious accomplishments when Balboa had taken him out of Hispaniola the previous year. Indeed, by that time, both dogs already bore ugly scars from Indian arrows. So Becerrillo, was passed around a couple times and used many times. As time passed, the astuteness of Becerrillo gained him a reputation for more than canine intelligence. He was a true perro sabio, learned dog, who readily could distinguish between friend and foe, fierce carib and docile Arawak, Christian and pagan, good and evil. He could be either affectionate or fierce, receiving a friendly pat with an appreciative wag of his tail or viciously punishing a pagan on signal. It was said that if an Indian fled from the camp of the Christians, even though it were midnight, Becerrillo, on command, would pursue the culprit, sometimes into the midst of at least 200 Indians, single him out, take him by the arm, and if he showed no resistance, led him unharmed back into captivity. Do you guys hear that? This dog was ill. If there were any sign of defiance, the dog would tear the fugitive to shreds. Indeed, the Indians came to fear this beast to the extent that they preferred to fight 100 Christians without him rather than 10 with him. You guys hear that? That's how much respect they had for Becerrillo, who was trained literally to kill Indians. But this was a smart dog, too. All right, continue a little ahead in the book. It says, in the conquest and settlement of Cuba, though many of the outrages were committed by his captains, Diego Velázquez condoned them and encouraged the use of dogs. It was not an uncommon sight, Las Casas recorded, to see soldiers accompanied by processions of slaves chained together and herded along like hogs to provide food for the hounds, all right? Indian slaves being used as food for the dogs. The more humane of the captains, he continued, killed the Indians first, but others simply turned their dogs loose upon living, terrified and naked victims. There were marketplaces, Las Casas claimed, where quarters of Indians were displayed as if they were hutches of sheep or hogs, and soldiers could be heard bargaining for the loan of a quarter of an Indian to feed to their dogs until they had time to slay another for repayment. Asked how he had fared after a Monteria Infernal, a soldier might reply that he had done quite well, for his dogs had slaughtered 15 or 20 natives. Rather than endure starvation or torture and inhuman treatment, many Indians employed in mines and on the plantations sought refuge in flight. To check their exodus, Velázquez raised and trained more dogs to pursuit and destruction. In despair, some Indians buried themselves alive, and throughout Cuba, suicides occurred. At last, opinion in Cuba reacted against the servers and comenderos, and royal authorities were asked to punish the offenders.
Says the American Pit Bull Terrier origins. I thought it was interesting because this is what we were just talking about. So they talk about the different theories about the American Pit Bull Terrier origins that exist. And he says down here, it says, according to the Mariano Peinado theory, the landlord that gave rise to the origin, the American Pit Bull Terrier, was based on already extinct a Spanish breed, the Spanish Alano. All right. And it says a little bit down in the page, says here, the first way in which the American Pit Bull Terrier began to originate itself was outlined 500 years ago when the Spanish conquerors in the America colonization bring in their boats several dogs of the Spanish Alano breed, so that they were facilitating them open way in the fight with the natives of the American South and Central. All right, so you see the picture here, they send the dogs out. With the course of the time already established, the colonists of Spain with his Alano in land of the American South and Central, these were to stud with dogs that lived there and without defined breed, originating a new and interesting variety of strong and powerful dog, which contributed diverse benefits to, and it's a little weird here, it says to, I guess it's trying to say to those who own them. It says here in Portugal they called to the Alano "you fall of roe," synonymous of dog to catch, to take hold, or to hold. In America, the denominations of prey dogs or dogs for the bull in Mexico, brave dog in Colombia, bulldog of Cuba in the Caribbean, Cordovan dog of fight in Argentinian bulldog in Argentina, or Fila Brasileiro in Brazil, are not more than the symbols of different original varieties, all from the Spanish Alano, who took initially the American colonization. All right, so all those dogs come from this Alano. In the stories of the writers of the time, it was spoken of the Alanos that the Spanish explorers took to cross the virgin forest or to watch the campings. There were some of these stories in which they narrated infinity of anecdotes with respect to intelligence, bravery, and fidelity that owned the Alanos. The March 24, 1495, within the Antilles, the Caribbean, La Española, present Santo Domingo, was developed the first battle in front of the Caribbean Indians, commanded by the Coronado cacique. The brother of Cristobal Bartolomé Colón employed 200 men. So Christopher Columbus' brother, Bartolomé, employed 200 men, 20 horses, and 20 Alanos, like Spanish forces. It was the debut of the Alanos in the American conquest. All right, you hear that's a debut. All right, they sick the dogs after your ancestors.
Very interesting about this dog being the ancestor. If you look at the American Pit Bull Terrier, you see resemblances of these Alano dogs or Mastiff type dogs. The one thing I found interesting was they said they bred it with a local type of dog. What local type of dog did we have here that was ancient, that was purebred? One thing I can think of was the Xolol or Xolotl. All right, so this is one right here, as you guys can see. That's a Xolotl. So imagine mixing this with one of those Alano dogs, Mastiffs. Could that have been the mixer of what they're talking about? How we get pit bulls today and all that. I'm just saying, what type of local dog did they mix them with? I wouldn't be surprised if it was the Xolotl dog, Anubis. Again, the Spanish Alano dog, mix them with a Xolotl, and then you might possibly get a Pit Bull Terrier and all these other breeds. They're calling American. All right, look at that. Hope you guys enjoyed this information on the dogs of Conquest. They kind of try to sugarcoat this history because it was cruel and it was pretty savage. Pura vida, mi gente. Much love and respect. Hawa.